Hello, my name is Carla Pelzer. I will be talking about refugee camps in Greece, European migration policy, and freedom of movement. I am a member of the Refugee Law Clinic Jena in Germany. We are an association that gives legal consultations to mainly refugees. I am very happy that Elsa gave me the opportunity to speak to you today. So, in the summer of 2019 and in the summer of this year, I spent several months on the Greek island of Samos, on which one of the so-called hotspots is located. I worked with the Refugee Law Clinic Berlin that established a legal aid project there. I would like to share my experiences of the time there with you and say some words to the EU migration policy in general. To start, I will give a short overview of the EU migration policy in recent years, and especially the EU-Turkey deal, of which you might have heard already. Then I will tell you about the current situation on Samos and about some events that occurred there during the summer. In the end, I will say a few words about what, in my opinion, is the solution to many problems: freedom of movement. I won't say much about the history of European Community and European Union migration policy, just one thing. While freedom of movement has been instated for nearly all EU citizens and people living within its borders by now, this has simultaneously led to a more restrictive visa policy and much fiercer controls at the external borders. While once upon a time, a person coming from a third state would get a visa to Germany and then, for example, and then be able to enter Germany only, now gets access to all of Schengen. In the last years, we have seen internal borders being reinstated and the mainstream discourse seemingly being in favor of ever stronger external borders. You might have heard about the Dublin III regulation. The European member states had agreed upon establishing a common European asylum system, which generally hasn't really worked out, but nevertheless, one rule in force is that every person is supposed to only be able to ask for asylum once within the EU member states. The Dublin regulation determines which member state will be responsible to deal with a person's asylum procedure. People in favor of this regulation would say they want to prevent asylum shopping because they seem to think that fleeing from one's home, leaving everything behind and searching for a safe place is just as fun as clothes shopping. There are some other factors which determine the responsible state, but mainly after the Dublin regulation, it is the first state of arrival. Since for most people coming from conflict regions, it is impossible to obtain visa. They are forced to come by boat or by land and will first arrive in Greece, Italy, or one of the other states at the external borders. They then technically must stay in those countries and can't choose where they would actually like to go. The situation in, for example, Greece is so bad, though, that persons illegally traveling to Germany cannot be returned, at least not before recognition. German authorities still try to do it, but are normally stopped by the courts. In some discussions about the Dublin regulation, I heard the demand to change the quota to make the northern states take in more people. It is important to know, though, that the Dublin regulation doesn't have any legally binding quotas at all. I personally do not believe in quotas, but in freedom of movement. Still, I think people must understand that there exists no legally binding mechanisms to distribute refugees in the different European Union member states. One might want to point out the relocation programs because the decisions made there were in fact legally binding. It was very low numbers though, and states like, for example, Germany only met a very low percentage of what they had initially agreed upon. Also, it is singular political decisions, so one can say that relocation doesn't really count. About the EU-Turkey deal. The EU-Turkey deal was agreed upon in March 2016, after many more people than in the previous years had reached the European Union. The member states should not have been taken by surprise. At some point, the situation in the Lebanese, Jordanian, and Turkish refugee camps got very bad, or much worse than before. The World Food Programme said that there soon wouldn't be enough food because it ran out of money. These facts were written down in UNHCR reports in 2013 and 14. The UNHCR is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The EU agency Frontex itself wrote in its annual risk analysis of 2013 and 14 that was very likely that many more Syrian refugees would be trying to make their way to the European Union in the near future. Still, in 2015, European member states weren't prepared to properly accommodate refugees. The European Union was looking for fast and easy solutions, so they came up with the EU-Turkey deal. It is no contract. The ECJ has declared its incompetence to rule on it. The deal says that all people that reach the Greek islands are to be returned to Turkey because it is considered a safe third country. Turkey has ratified the Geneva Refugee Convention, but with the limitation that it will only apply it to refugees coming from Europe, meaning that Syrians and Afghans, for example, can never get a refugee status in the sense of the Geneva Convention. Turkey has attacked northern Syria in contradiction to international law and also prosecutes political dissidents within its own borders. The EU gave a lot of money to Turkey to deal with the many refugees, which to my information that comes from the International Organization on Migration was also used in its purpose. Furthermore, a resettlement program is installed, which is kind of a good thing for the people who benefit from it. But unfortunately, there are just few places. One cannot apply for it, and beneficiaries are chosen very restrictively. In Germany, people from Afghanistan, for example, often have to go to the courts to be granted protection. This, of course, only works when one is already on the territory and was able to ask for asylum. The deal also, and now I'll finally start talking about camps, introduced the so-called hotspot system. On the Greek islands, there are 5 hotspots which are located on Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Leros, and Kos. There is much media attention on Moria on Lesbos. The situation on the other islands is pretty similar, though. Here on the map, you can see how close those islands are to Turkey. All people arriving on the islands are registered by the police and then brought to the camp. The so-called fast-track border procedure is supposed to take 6 months at the most. First, it is evaluated whether a person's asylum claim is admissible. If a person, actually, I have another slide here. Yeah, here, so here you can see the camp of Samos. You can see the containers there, and then all the shacks that are built around it. And here, yeah, so the hotspot in the fast-track border procedure. As I said, it is first evaluated whether a person's asylum claim is admissible. If a person is considered specifically vulnerable, that is unaccompanied minors, disabled people, or pregnant persons, they are exempted from the fast-track border procedure and should be transferred to the mainland to do their asylum procedure there. If a person convinces the authorities that Turkey, in fact, is no safe third country for her individually, she will not be returned to Turkey either, but do her asylum procedure on the island. Most people reaching the Greek islands are not returned to Turkey because, surprisingly, it is found in many individual cases that Turkey is in fact not safe. Unless one gets a so-called open card, one is not allowed to leave the island, leading to people being stuck there for months and years even. The asylum interviews are conducted by the Greek Asylum Service that is supported by the European Asylum Support Office. I will now tell you a bit about the general situation on Samos. Most refugees currently on Samos come from Syria, Afghanistan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. I will not talk about the living conditions very long because I assume that you have all seen the pictures in the media. Basically, the camp used to be a military base and consists of containers surrounded by barbed wire. The containers are in very bad conditions. The hygienic conditions are unhealthy. Also, the camp on Samos is situated on a rather steep hill, which causes problems for old or pregnant people and people with war injuries. Most refugees do not live within the real camp, but in the so-called jungle, which are huts that they build for themselves around the camp. Here on this slide, you can see a picture of the jungle. Now, a bit more specific about the food. The food that is handed out in the camp often is bad or even expired. It's not food that might just be inedible for persons with weak stomachs, but it often is literally moldy. This picture is of bread that was handed out for breakfast in the camp. Many people still go to the food line anyways, in which they have to wait for up to 2 hours to get the one little bottle of water that one gets a day. Next, long procedures. While the so-called fast-track border procedure, as I already mentioned, is supposed to take 6 months at the most, many people I have met on Samos stay there for over a year or even up to 2 years. The date of one's interview is written in the asylum seeker ID, of which you can see a picture on the slide. When people first get the asylum seeker ID, their interview date normally is set for 2 or 3 years later. This mostly is not the real date. It will very probably be preponed, but the message that people are giving in the very beginning is, you will stay here for ages. Here on this picture, I hope you can see that. You can see that this person applied for asylum in 2019 and that the interview date is scheduled for 2021. In 2019, I even met people who had the interview date set for 2022 or 2023 even. While procedures take far too long on the side of the authorities, the refugees themselves have to respect ridiculous deadlines of sometimes just 5 days to go against a negative decision. This is also a huge problem because there's far too few lawyers on the island, which leads to people often having to do the appeal by themselves. We have the problem of very short deadlines in Germany as well, where procedural safeguards for refugees have been altered dramatically in the last years, which doesn't really make sense at all in this kind of life-threatening decisions. Then, a school. None or almost none of the refugee children go to the normal Greek schools, but go to an NGO-run school if they go at all. There have been protests by Greek parents who didn't want their children to be schooled with refugee children, and there are administrative requirements that are basically impossible to meet for people living in the camp. The right to education is laid down in Directive 2013/33 EU, which is the directive that regulates the accommodation conditions states should provide for during the asylum procedure. And the right to education is also laid down in the first additional protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights. Also, Greek national law says that foreign children have a right to education just as Greek children. As I said, though, this is sadly not enforced on Samos. Stella Rise is the non-government organization that runs the school for refugees there. Unfortunately, the building has been severely damaged due to the earthquake that hit the region recently. Then another huge issue is psychological issues. It is probably clear to everyone that most people in the camp have psychological issues from what happened before their flight in the home countries and during the flight, and also crossing the Mediterranean in boats. This is enhanced by the situation in the camp that is traumatic to many. Thousands of people of different nationalities are cramped in inhumane conditions. While MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, which again is an NGO and not the state, has some psychologists, so MSF, they have some psychologists on the field, but most persons have no access to psychological support. Already in 2017, MSF warned of a mental health crisis for asylum seekers. About medical assistance in general. On the islands, it is extremely difficult to get medical assistance. The hospital in Vathi, which is the town where the camp is located, is very small, and refugees are normally not allowed to enter. There is security people in front of the hospitals who will not let you in. They must be referred by the camp doctor to be seen by someone in the hospital. It sometimes takes months for people just to get an appointment, and treatment to serious diseases is often unavailable on the island. Just to get an appointment with a camp doctor already is extremely difficult. Some people go there every day for months and wait in the line starting at 4 o'clock in the morning, and will still not be able to see the doctor. People with serious diseases should normally get an open card, which means that they would be allowed to leave the island, or which means that they should be transferred to the mainland, but often don't. I've met a man with hepatitis B. I've met a man who was deaf-mute, and even a man who had shrapnel in his head, and none of them had open cards. There are the two NGOs, Mediquality and MSF, who are, okay, there's something missing here, anyways, who are taking care of the people on the islands. Nevertheless, they are obviously not as well equipped as hospitals would be. And also, again, it's NGOs, while medical assistance is, of course, in the responsibility of the state. Here on the picture, you can see the Mediquality next to the camp. For some weeks now, they have been obliged to set up their base in the camp because residents are not allowed to leave due to COVID-19. Vulnerable people in general, as already mentioned, there's this category in Greek law that declares some people to be specifically vulnerable, but even persons that are recognized as vulnerable often don't get transfers though, or have to wait for it for months. While pregnant persons, for example, are supposed to be transferred, there have been many who had to give birth on Samos. Also, minors can be found sitting all alone in the jungle with no one officially taking care of them. The Refugee Law Clinic and Avocats Sans Frontières, Lawyers Without Borders, have filed up to 50 Rules 39 to the European Court of Human Rights. Rule 39 regulates interim measures that can be very useful in urgent matters. The European Court of Human Rights then ordered Greece to take measures to not infringe upon Article 3 of the Convention. This, however, can only ever improve the situation of the individual in question and not for everyone. About families. Last year, it happened several times that families were torn apart because the authorities did not believe them to be a family. They would simply say that a woman looked too old to be some child's mother and transfer the child to the mainland as an unaccompanied minor. One family we met was able to prevent that by having the mother take a DNA test. The cheapest test one can get on Samos costs 90 euros though, and they had to do it for 2 people at least. For clarification, an adult person on Samos will get 90 euros per month. The family was thus forced to pay that much money to prove to the authorities that they were in fact related and to be able to stay together. On the other hand, the authorities often treat real unaccompanied minors as adults or, while acknowledging that they are underage, just leave them on the island for ages. Many minors who arrive on the islands will be registered as majors because they don't have papers, or sometimes even if they have them. The only solution is to register for an age assessment, which will be done by doctors. There is, however, no doctor on the island who seems to be able or allowed to exercise this age assessment. It therefore only takes place every few months when a team comes to Samos specifically to do the age assessment. This wrong registering does not only happen to people who are 16, 17 and where one could have a doubt about their age, but also to much younger children. I once had a consultation with a boy who was 14, clearly looked like 14, but who had been registered at 26. Nowadays, many people in the camp have family elsewhere in Europe. In 2016, Germany stopped family reunification for people who only had subsidiary protection for 2 years until 2018. Now it is possible again, but still very difficult. Subsidiary protection is a status one can get when not qualifying for refugee status. In the last years, Germany gave only subsidiary protection to many Syrians, while Greece, for example, would always give refugee status. Fortunately, the ECJ has delivered a judgment just last week saying that at least persons that fled from military service are entitled to refugee status, which means that the German BAMF, which is the name of the authority that is responsible to decide about asylum claims, will have to change their practice. Nevertheless, many people couldn't get their families to Europe via the safe way in the last years. Instead, they had to come with the boats as well, and are now waiting in the camps to be reunified by the rules of the Dublin regulation. Again, Germany, however, rejects over 70% of family reunification requests. The reasoning often is something like in the case of a minor boy who wasn't allowed to join his adult siblings because Germany said that the flight with a plane might be traumatizing for him. In the beginning of this year, you might remember, Germany took in 50 minors, which already is a ridiculous number. While they wanted praise for having saved these children, it was mostly forgotten to mention that most of the group had requested family reunification, had been rejected, but would probably have won in front of the courts. Then, another problem is the so-called smugglers in prison. Back in 2015, it used to be smugglers who were driving the boats to the islands and often back to Turkey afterwards. It is, of course, already a thing one can question whether helping people to get to a safe place when there's no other way should really be punished. Whatsoever, nowadays, everyone, and by everyone, I also mean the Greek prosecutors and the judges, so everyone knows that the smugglers themselves are not in the boats anymore. It is refugees themselves who are driving the boats. People are either getting a discount for the crossing, or, and this is what mainly happens, people are asked or forced to steer when already arriving at the beach on the Turkish side. The unlucky person in that position is then, when having reached Greece, taken in by Greek police, charged with smuggling, and faces prison sentences of several years. Just recently, a boat came close to Samos again after a long time of no official arrivals at all, and sadly the boat sank. A 6-year-old Afghan boy died. His 23-year-old father is now in prison and faces a sentence of up to 10 years. His lawyer, who is a local from Samos, has dealt with many such cases in the last years. Then let's now talk about illegal pushbacks. This picture is from Samos. It's a Frontex boat. Frontex is German, is also German on Samos. By this time, you will probably all have heard about what has been an open secret for months. Since March, nearly no one has reached the Greek islands. Boats on the way are consequently pushed back. Actors involved are the Greek Coast Guards as well as Frontex. Frontex is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. You might have heard about it in the media in the last time. Normally, the Greek Coast Guard and Frontex are allowed to notify the Turkish Coast Guards when they spot boats that are still in Turkish waters. Once the boats are in Greek waters, however, they are obliged to take the people in. What has happened in the last month, though, was the following. Boats that were in Greek waters already have been pulled back with ropes. Greek Coast Guard boats came close to refugee boats, caused huge waves, and made everyone on the boat fall into the water until the Turkish Coast Guards came to the rescue. Or people were taken into the Coast Guard's boats only to be driven back into Turkish waters and be left there on life rafts. And last but not least, people who had actually already been on the islands were picked up by the police and brought back into Turkish waters. I personally believe in open borders and that no one should be forced to cross by boats anyways. But even for those who do not share my opinion, this practice should be alarming because it's illegal. It breaches with the principle of non-refoulement, which is jus cogens. Non-refoulement means that no one shall be returned to a country in which they might be in danger of persecution. It means that every person must have the right to ask for asylum and to have their asylum claim processed once having reached the state's territory. Unfortunately, this practice of illegal pushbacks has now been going on for months. A Greek minister has even openly spoken of all the people that had successfully been pushed back. Some people are pointing to a recent verdict of the European Court of Human Rights. The court has issued a verdict in February, ND&T versus Spain, saying that if people were attaining the territory with the use of force, they could be pushed back, and pointed out that one could have gone to the border crossings or an embassy to ask for asylum there. The event in question had taken place at the fence between the Spanish enclave of Melilla and Morocco. It is not actually possible for refugees to get to the border crossings there because they will be held back by Moroccan security forces. Even if it weren't so, it is a very peculiar understanding of human rights if they can be taken away based on the actions of an individual. If you're interested in that, you should read what the former judge Paolo Pinto de Albuquerque had to say about it. I mentioned this judgment here because several people have quoted it to legitimize pushbacks and even the shots that were fired against refugees at the Greek-Turkish land border in March of this year. Also, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, hasn't really sent the best signals to Greece. When Greek coast guards were shooting at people arriving at the border in March, she flew over the scene with a helicopter, called Greece the shield of Europe, and the EU Commission gave 700 million euros to Greece to strengthen its borders. In general, about the involvement of Frontex, there was some research coming out in the last time, and I guess we'll learn even more about it in the coming months. Now, about the new camp. While most people were rather occupied with the corona pandemic, this summer the European Commission approved 130 million euros for Greece to build new camps. You can see here a picture of the new camp on Samos, which is still in construction. The current Samos camp is very close to the city of Vathi, meaning camp residents can go grocery shopping, stroll along the promenade, or go to the beach. The new camp, however, is up in the hills. There's nothing around it, not even trees. And to reach the nearest city, Mytilene, by foot takes about 1 hour and a half. Also, as you can see, there is 3 rows of barbed wire around the camp with a carway in between for police cars to patrol. Here, the picture is not the best, I'm sorry, but I hope you can see there's a children's playground with barbed wire around it. The camp is still empty, but people are expected to be transferred there soon. I will now talk about some specific events that occurred in this summer of 2020. So, destruction of huts. Persons from the Greek authorities were one day walking around and asking persons about their Ausweis. The Ausweis is what people call the asylum applicants card. Curiously, the German word is used to name this card. So, anyways, Greek authorities were going around and asking persons who lived in the so-called jungle about their Ausweis. Those who had been rejected or accepted, meaning those who weren't in the procedure anymore, got a mark on their check. They put like a cross on the check. Also, some persons who actually still were in the procedure got a mark on their check. In the next days, they would come back with bulldozers to tear down the huts, leaving the people with nothing. This happened to about 20 people. Many of them belong to the Kurdish community, who just a few months ago fled from bombs being dropped on their houses. In general, this is a huge problem at the moment because people who are not in the procedure anymore are not allowed to live in the camps anymore. They are thrown out and then mostly end up on the streets because they also don't get money anymore. And here, these shacks that were destroyed are kind of a situation that shouldn't exist anyways, because people are supposed to get a place in a container in a camp, but because the camp is too full, they had to build their huts around it. And then when the procedure ended, would get them destroyed though. So next thing, Corona. Obviously there is COVID-19. The virus has by now reached all of the camps on the different islands. In the month before, nothing was done in preparation. The Greek authorities just imposed a curfew on only the camp residents, but not locals or tourists, between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. Other than this rather senseless yet restrictive measure, no strategies were developed. When the virus first broke out, people were locked into containers for 14 days to isolate them. They had to sleep on the floor and didn't even have sleeping bags in the beginning. They would get the food from the camp, which, as I showed you in the beginning, is often inedible, and weren't able to get other food. After a while, camp residents did not go to testing anymore, which wasn't conducted as much anyways, because they were afraid of being locked up in the isolation zones. A general lockdown has been introduced now, which means that no one is allowed to leave the camp anymore. People in the camp live very close to one another. Social distancing is not possible, and even less is washing one's hands regularly. MSF is going around in the camp to educate about the virus and how to protect oneself. One of the strategies has been to give persons who belong to a corona risk group tents and ask them to go to an isolated spot and stay away from everyone else, because there's just not no other possibility to protect oneself. The Greek authorities and UNHCR are supposed to evacuate the risk groups, but this happens only very slowly. Here on the snapshot, I hope you can see it. Yeah, first on the top, you can see how in the last weeks, this snapshot from beginning of October, and on above, you can see how no people have been arriving in the last weeks in comparison to last year. And then down, you can see shielding against COVID-19, that they had planned to transfer risk groups to especially old people and immune compromised persons to the mainland. But in that specific week, for example, no one had been moved. And we saw snapshots just like that in other weeks as well. Yeah, the situation is still really bad. Hasn't really changed a lot. And as I said, MSF is going around in the camp, and also the medical team, as you saw in the picture earlier, has set up their base next to the camp to be able to take care of people. Then about the fires. I guess you all heard about the big fire in Moria when the whole camp burned down. Meanwhile, there has been fires on the other islands too. On Samos, there was a fire in October of last year, one in April of this year, two in September, and two in the last 3 weeks. The last two fires made 600 people lose their self-constructed huts and burned down many of the containers within the original camp. When last summer there was a bushfire that threatened to come close to a touristic town but didn't in the end, 100 tourists were evacuated and brought to other hotels. When there's fires in the camp, however, people are left to sleep in the streets and get tents by NGOs. One person I know got all his belongings burned for the third time by now. Here on the left, you can see one of the fires of September. It was actually a rather small fire because only the containers of the miners burned. Then in the middle, you can see a picture of last October. People were sleeping on the streets for days just after the fire. And then on the right, you can see tents that were given out by NGOs on the football field. And this was in a time when Corona was already happening. It hadn't reached the camp so far, but at that point, everyone was very, very worried that it would soon. And yeah, obviously, this isn't a situation in which you can properly prevent COVID from spreading. So yes, the situation right now is very difficult because, as I said, there was 2 fires just in the last weeks, and people are sleeping in tents again or are reconstructing their shacks. Yeah, but also it's end of November now. It's getting cold and rainy. So I hope to have given you a good overview of the situation in the camps at the external borders of the European Union. If you want to get engaged in the fight against the current situation, there's many advocacy groups all over Europe. There are amazing Greek lawyers and NGOs on the ground who always need support. And also, I would very much like to advocate the concept of freedom of movement. As European law students, you probably very much enjoy the freedom of movement we enjoy within the European borders and also globally. My vision is to make this possible for anyone. Unfortunately, when it comes to refugees, the discourse is often hijacked by a right-wing narrative, which makes it harder to talk about what would make sense morally and be more just to everyone. One professor of mine once said that the problem of open borders would be that then people could come into the European Union who wouldn't have a right to the refugee status. During the time of the asylum procedure, they would have the time to integrate into society and get a residence permit in another way and would then not be deportable anymore. I wonder whether this really is such a horrific scenario, though, and whether to that goal it is worth it to infringe on human rights and happiness in the extent as it is happening right now. If you have any more questions or would like some more information, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much for listening and have a good day, everyone.